Okay, hello again. I'll be chairing this panel, and there are a few PowerPoint presentations, so we probably won't be sitting at the table except for the Q&A. And the topic of this session is archives, museums, and digital memory, which of course is these are issues central to transitional justice, even though not unique to transitional justice. And I asked to chair this panel and not others due to my schedule, but actually also because I have I dabble a little bit in these areas. I've written on intangible cultural heritage, which is a UNESCO legal term, and recently also on the effects of, or the interaction of technology with intangible cultural heritage. So just as an example of some of the issues we'll be talking about in this panel that aren't uniquely transitional justice, but actually more, for example, about climate justice. So the island of Tuvalu, which is gradually submerging because of global warming, has a project to, they're essentially uploading all their cultural heritage to the cloud, so that even if they end up as climate refugees in Melbourne or in Los Angeles, then they will still have their heritage and they'll have a source for future generations in terms of collective memory. And as a result, of course, we'll also be able to enjoy Tuvaluan cultural heritage, which otherwise we would only enjoy if we would go to Tuvalu. So that's just by way of a very brief introduction. I'll introduce our four speakers. I think only three are here at the moment, but Noah Heisler-Rubin will hopefully join us soon. Our first speaker is Ruti Teitel, who in the category of needs no introduction, certainly not in a conference on transitional justice. She is the Ernst C. Stiefel Professor of Comparative Law, the Director of the Institute for Global Law, Justice and Policy, and a co-director of the Center for International Law at New York Law School. She is also affiliated faculty at New York University's Masters in International Relations, and also regularly teaches at the law faculty here on Mount Scopus. One of the world's leading experts in international human rights and the foremost thought leader of transitional justice, the author of a wide body of work, including 3 books, Globalizing Transitional Justice, Humanities Law from 2011, and the iconic Transitional Justice from 2000, all published by Oxford University Press. And also a founding co-chair of the American Society of International Law Interest Group on Transitional Justice and the Rule of Law. After Ruti, and there's been a slight change in the order, we'll hear from Hagit Kaysal. Hagit Kaysal is a researcher and activist. She teaches civic and feminist approaches to technology in Bezalel Academy of Art and Design and Tel Aviv University. Her research and creative work concern the politics of data and digitization in the city, as well as in museums and archives. She also explores community-driven science and do-it-yourself technology for communities in situations of conflict and colonization. She has recently been a postdoc at the Minerva Stiftung in Berlin's Natural History Museum. She is currently a postdoc fellow at the Minerva Center for Human Rights at Tel Aviv University. And after Hagit, we will hear from Dr. Ofli Knan is an artist and researcher. She works across time-based media, performances, and installations. She is a guest professor at the Technische Universität Wien and a research fellow at the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis at the University of Amsterdam. Her work appeared at Tate Britain, Venice Architecture Biennale, Metropolitan Museum of Art, in Hotim Institute in Brazil, and several other places, including the Kunsthalle in Vienna. Knani currently works on a project at the International Space Station. So I really look forward to hearing about that.
That would not be included.
Maybe in the Q&A. Okay, that was a prompt. And fourth, we'll hear from Noah Heisler-Rubin. She is a geographer and urban planner, a graduate of the Hebrew University. Her research deals with spatial aspects of cultural, political, and social convergences, and the influences that these have on modern urban planning. And I'm just simultaneously translating from Hebrew. That's why, and scrolling down my phone because I don't have her full bio. But she also teaches at B'Tselem and on these topics. So I have 20 minutes each, if possible even less, so that we'll have more because we're already running late. So please, Ruti, let's go.
Is this working? Thanks. So I'll stay here. Hopefully you all can hear me. Very grateful to the organizers, to Tomer, Danny, Ron, Einat, Yofit, and so on for this conference. It's a real opportunity. I can see that our panel in particular is extremely interdisciplinary, and the project that I'm going to talk about, just to summarize, is coming out in the London Review of International Law. It's called the Justice Archive, Transitional Justice and Digital Memory. But what I want to raise in this context is the preoccupations that we have today regarding democracy and in particular democracy slippage and the digital. And so my remarks are going to address this, and I think the real question to raise at the end is, what is the relationship of these concerns, the digital memory, democracy, and transitional justice? And I just Kieran talked about the 5 minute, if you, on Netflix, you don't want to wait till the end. If you don't want to wait till the end, I think there's a big question mark about the relationship of digital memory and transitional justice. And it's not at all a given that these are helpful developments. So I just want to start with, first of all, we got into this question of the Justice Archive with my colleague, Dr. Yavo Rangelov of the London School of Economics, and we presented in Belgrade, on what we saw was a kind of revival of concern with documentation and truth. In Latin America, it took a certain form, building on decades of the documentation regarding the disappeared. In Eastern Europe, it was taking a different form. And I want to, in my remarks, talk about that historical context and the ways that the current practices might be seen as different, insofar as they bring in new technology and different actors, civil society actors, which is, of course, our topic writ large for these last 2 days. What we see in Latin America and Eastern Europe, Middle East, Syria, most documented conflict so far, Ukraine as well, is a real concern for documentation. And what I want to do is put it in the context of the first round, since I was around for that, decades of transitional justice in Latin America that gave rise to the right to truth, as was summarized by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Basically, and this was mentioned in the first panel when Kieran was talking about disappearances in Northern Ireland. In Latin America, it gave rise to a verb and a subject, to disappear someone, los desaparecidos. That horrendous offense where there's no body, there's a cover-up by the government, gave rise to a tremendous challenge to investigation and to the truth about where one's loved ones were. And there were very powerful, groups of civil society actors mothers, often are not educated, that were able to stand up to the government. And so from the very beginning, this area of the claim for truth was taken up by civil society actors, often with representatives, but they were victims, families, etc. And so from the very beginning in Latin America, this is the context of an area for NGOs, and you still have them today. The mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, as they were known, gave rise to the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, and they are still working on crimes against humanity cases, abductions, again, disappearances, but of the children of victims that often died in prison, children that were given over to childless right-wing military families. And so this has kept the kind of drumbeat going in, for example, Argentina, and trials continue, believe it or not, regarding offenses that happened in the 1970s, crimes against humanity cases. And so and I'll talk about this in a little bit, what you have in Latin America is this cooperation between civil society and the state. And I want to contrast it to the developments in the 1990s and today in Eastern Europe, which is that in Eastern Europe, and in particular we focused on the Balkans, the investigation was carried out by outside actors, international organizations, the UN establishing the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And so, rightly or wrongly, this has been a truth that has not been fully received, and the outreach was limited. There are several different angles. You could think of it as the way people evaluate the French Revolution. Has it worked? Well, we don't know. Let's see. It may well be that enough time has not passed, but certainly there is ongoing controversy regarding the 1990s and the records of the ICTY. And nevertheless, one of the main reasons for the international court that was convened, as you may recall, during conflict, was to get at the truth and to consolidate truth, even in the midst of the war. There were statements by Madeleine Albright and by the first chief prosecutor, Richard Goldstone. So you have established both in Latin America this idea of right to truth, and in Eastern Europe, in Europe, you have statements by the European Court of Human Rights, but coming out of Eastern Europe, case law, very often Russian case law, rights to investigate. And I write about this in a piece on the right to accountability, a prior piece. So how is it different today, and what's going on? So what you find is a concern, an anxiety. In Latin America, it's an anxiety about slippage, potential democracy slippage, although the continent writ large is doing okay in comparison to some other regions. But the fact that civil society had been so involved in documentation raised issues for the civil society actors about what was going to happen to the records after the passage of time. So I have interviewed the director of the leading organization Memoria Abierta, Open Memory in Argentina, and they have UNESCO support. They're very concerned about ensuring that the archives that they have become digitized. So I would say that in Latin America, as a general matter, for example, Chile and Argentina, they have archives that relate to the transitional justice processes that occurred during that period. So they have Truth Commission reports that exist as part of archives, and they have trial records in the case of Argentina. Most of the continent went for amnesties, as was discussed earlier. I have to say the transitions in Latin America occurred before the International Criminal Court and before this kind of idea of accountability, particularly for crimes against humanity, and query whether those agreements could stand today. And I think this is true of South Africa, as was raised earlier on. So they have these archives, and the concern is digitizing them. And I would say that the digital project it lags behind the archival project. In the Balkans, it's different, and they are just now, civil society is building out archives, and there's a different relationship to the state, which we can talk about in just a minute. So, for example, in Chile, they have an archive that is connected to human rights. In Colombia as well, and you'll be hearing about that later on. You have the Truth Commission report, and they create the Human Rights Archive associated with it. So it was very exciting to see that transitional justice occurring in real time does relate itself to a future and to practices of human rights. In terms of the Balkans, and again, if Javor were here, unfortunately, he had a conflict. If we're talking about distinctions between Eastern Europe and Latin America, there's much more of a contentious relationship with the past and with the ICTY. You have a group now, various groups. One that might be exciting for this part of the world, it's called the RECOM, where various different ethnicities are contributing to a database of victims and practices concerning their disappearance. So the RECOM database is going forward. There are also dossiers. This is all a lot of it being produced by a particular NGO, the Humanitarian Law Center, that Javor Rangelov has been head of the board of, and Natasha Kandic, who I brought here in the context of the Fried Gal Colloquium some years ago, really initiated, and she was pivotal in trying to bring witnesses to the ICTY from the region and supporting those developments. But I think that what one might see is that while in Latin America this work essentially has been done. There have been trials, there have been transitional justice processes that are local. In the Balkans, what we're seeing now is some kind of effervescence after the ICTY, where youth activists are using data, using arts, and in different ways to express their concerns about the past and about the future. And so it's dynamic, it's collective, but it's really distinct. It could be distinguished from the Latin American archives. Now, what are some of the dilemmas? And then I just want to gesture to the normative directions in the future. So the dilemmas, part of the dilemma of civil society being at the helm is what do we imagine as the relationship between the public and the private here? And certainly, in the Balkans, the relationship between these private actors and the current leadership in Serbia, and you could say to the West, in terms of the ICTY, has been one of contestation. And so that is, the general sense of what these practices are about. They are engaged in a process that's dynamic, but that is a real distinction. With respect to Latin America, there's a different kind of troubling kind of relationship, which is in many ways, it seems ideal. It's extremely cooperative with the state. If you think about it in Argentina, the state generally under Peronist government has been very supportive of human rights trials and very supportive of transitional justice. But often these developments, at least of late, have been critiqued for their politics, for their politicization, and even one could say a possibility of co-optation by the state. And if you can imagine cases where victims are in litigation with the state, it's problematic to have the state control these civil society archives. So there's no clear answer to this, but there, as one woman who directed the Memoria Abierta explained to me, she says, part of the problem is we have scarce resources, but the other problem is we have no rule of law. We don't have principles yet for accessing these archives, and this is being done in a case-by-case way. To give you an example, Luis Moreno Ocampo, the first chief prosecutor, who I knew because of coming from Argentina, and he's come to the region here as well as a guest of the Fried Gal Colloquium, he donated his records to Memoria Abierta. So, those are records that concern criminal justice processes, and quite, you can see that, and you can imagine that there's going to be a different rule of law with respect to, for example, witness testimony, other kinds of negotiations that may have happened in those cases than some that might relate to the Truth Commission report, the Nunca Más report, etc. Argentina also has a film archive, which is exciting and being supported by the state. So those are some tensions. I would say there are tensions in what we think of as civil society, and tensions that relate to the public-private domain. In addition, there are tensions that relate to the technology, and I just want to raise these here, and Tomer brought these up, and these are tensions that go beyond transitional justice, obviously, but they do go to the question of how productive are these developments in terms of what we might imagine the contribution of transitional justice archives could be for either democracy promotion or human rights protection. So, whereas in the beginning, in the Latin American context, the drumbeat was for an official story, right? We wanted an official story. We wanted the state to acknowledge what it had done with respect to disappearances, and it was very important that it be stable, that this be consolidated. What you see with the technology is that it's very difficult to maintain the adherence to that idea. Most of these databases are collections rather than a consolidated account. And of course, what the narrative will be, what the story will depend on the curators of the collection, but also the participants in the collection. So depending on how dynamic this is, a website that's interactive, then you might well end up with various different stories. Now, how troubled should we be about that? I think that is just something to consider. And of course, a lot of this does relate to civil society because it relates to how civil will that society be in terms of the participants in those, whether in the original collection, the databases, but also how we think about the curation going forward. And I know that there are folks that are going to be talking about the museum context, so I'm sure that they will address that. But certainly we saw in the Balkans, for example, that potentially broad participation can lead to potentially contesting narratives, or inconsistent narratives, or fragmented narratives. And certainly we know international law is fragmented, but this certainly adds another element here because the users are generally individuals when we go into cyberspace. And so we are engaged in an individual pursuit of potentially fragmented memory. And so these are all questions. They're normative questions. Now, so far, the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights has been concerned enough about the absence of rule of law in this area to come up with principles. They have recommended, and Fabian Salvioli has made this a very big part of his rapporteurship at the UN, they have recommended a commitment, duties of the state to protection of archives, justice-related archives. And so that's an area where we see these coming together. And the idea is that if the archive exists, to protect the archive, but if the archive doesn't exist, to help support it financially and in other ways. Fabian Salvioli has gone farther, and he spoke about this here several years ago, right before the pandemic. He was a guest here at Minerva and Afrigal, and he spoke about the need for a fifth pillar of transitional justice to be recognized. And the fifth pillar, we heard about the fourth, the fifth that he recommends is memorialization. And so, in his view, memorialization, which is what these archives claim to be doing, is directly connected to education and to promotion of human rights and democracy. If so, it's not necessarily a linear path, but he's certainly, we've seen this in other countries where we're combating false news, combating hate speech online, and some of the concerns that Tomer raised. They're certainly not unique to this area, but they certainly will be pivotal in thinking about it going forward. So I just want to, I know that my time is up, so I just want to end by saying that what we have here is an exciting and dynamic potential collaboration between civil society and the state. And then on the one hand, it's an opportunity, one could say, for a basis for a shared narrative for a democratization going forward. But on the other hand, what we also see is that this is an area with a number of, multiple participants, multiple potential narratives, and the possibility not just of preservation of data, but also of repurposing of data and a dynamic in a dynamic collection. So I think the jury is out. We will see which of these messages triumphs. The connective aspect of cyber, which could lead to solidarity, or a more dynamic kind of, if you will, set of competing and multiple messages, which in itself could be a sign of a liberal democracy. So I'll end there, and I hope there'll be time later for Q&A. Yeah.
Thank you, Ruthie, for opening this panel. I think you already started talking about the need for digitization and also the troubles of digitization. It's also interesting to see the unequal distribution of resources to digitize, and I'm going to talk about the big museum, the big Western Museum, where you have a lot of resources to digitize. So unlike what you were talking about in the Memoria Abierta and Ofri's presentation on Brazil, this is where resources are abound. So museums, Western Museum, big Western Museum, we all know them, and most of us know them as visitors. And for the most of us, it will be hard to imagine that the major part of the collections that are held by museums are hidden from sight. In the big Western Museum, displayed objects can account for as little as 2% of the collections that are stored away. In the Natural History Museum in Berlin, this means 2% of approximately 30 million specimens in back rooms. So museum storage, as the cultural historian Miriam Brucius reminds us, is not simply the millions of objects that lay hidden in the back of exhibitions halls, but also where ways of knowing take shape. This is where scientific, logistical, archival, institutional, and political actors and actions are brought together by and for specialized groups of people. In fact, the backstage of museums was never oriented towards the public. It is the black box of the museum, actually, where scientific activity takes shape among closed groups, communities of experts. The huge volume of objects and specimens in Western institutions are now going through transition. They're taken out of the storage and brought into the practical activity and workflows of museum staff, technology specialists also, and volunteers. And then they are mass digitized and integrated into digital portals and global databases. This way, they will be accessible to broader research communities and, of course, to various publics. No longer classified access to stored specimens. From now on, digital specimens accessible online. Hundreds of years worth of collections data unlocked, and it seems as though the black box of the museum storage is being opened. So I had the unique opportunity of staying at Minerva. Staying as a Minerva research fellow for 2 years at the Humanities of Nature department in the Museum of Natural History in Berlin. I had a little office in the back side of the museum within the black box. And this talk is basically based on the work I've done with my hosts, Tahani Nadim, Katja Kaiser, and Ina Hoyman, whose work is really instrumental in advancing discourses and practices of decolonization in this important and central museum. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Museum of Natural History in Berlin opened an exhibition titled Digitize. This title was, as you can see, celebratory, and it was a call and even an imperative to join the celebration of innovative technologies that promise brighter futures. And this exhibition was basically letting visitors take a peek into the mechanisms of digitization. This is how it looked. these huge machines with conveyor belts that move objects from one place to another on long assembly lines that turn classified insects in old wooden cabinets and drawers into standardized digital specimens. This technological mechanism is generating digital specimens and databases based on universalized data standards, such as FAIR. Maybe some of you know. FAIR is the acronym of Findable, Accessible, Interoperable, and Reusable. And the FAIR principles advance open science and interdisciplinary research through the design of efficient metadata categories that enable sharing, distributing, and reusing existing scientific data across different epistemic domains and technological systems. Aiming for 5,000, even 6,000 specimens, digitized insects a day, it illustrates quite clearly the coming together of science and industry and the logics of digitization, efficiency, speed, and volume, along with openness, transparency, and participation. So in natural history museums, these millions of preserved specimens are invaluable for advancing research in many fields, including urgent matters such as climate change and biodiversity loss. Mass digitization of more than 1 billion specimens preserved in 28 countries and the rapid algorithmic analysis of huge data sets in global databases such as this one online platform, GBIF, Global Biodiversity Information Facility, basically allow to advance the production of new knowledge regarding the Earth's biodiversity and help researchers know which species are there and what can we learn from the population trends in the past 200 years, at least, and in different places around the world. So this is important because species biodiversity is dramatically affected by human-induced climate change and has been linked with planetary health and social health. But we can ask, what are the costs of that logic? What gets lost when speed and efficiency rules? In one word, we can say history. This is especially crucial if we consider the colonial context and responsibility of museums and their collections. So hundreds of years of collecting, classifying, naming, labeling produced abundance of specimen data that serves researchers in preserving scientific memory, continuity, and discovery. But once we expand the purview to questions of colonial context, these data stand as silent testimonies, you can say, of the colonial extraction of resources, of animals, plants, minerals, and other materials from indigenous lands, including the expropriation of ethnological artifacts and human remains. Even in places where addressing colonial context is a state policy, like Germany, digitization processes that are governed by the digital economy of speed and efficiency are bound to eliminate historical testimonies and evidence that sits there in storage on shelves, in the materiality of the objects, in labels, field notes, and diaries. And this is because speed and efficiency require a high degree of abstraction and decontextualization, so that they will be allowing to create standardized data that would be findable, accessible, and interoperable. And these processes of abstraction that were designed mostly by computer scientists tend to eliminate social and situated types of data. To understand this, I want to focus now for a few minutes on what the history of natural history teaches us on the nature and structure of data. So as David Sepkoski shows, the database did not emerge with computers. And he demonstrates it through the case of natural history and its early modern systems of classification and quantification. In fact, you cannot store data without a classification system. So the structures of digital data are built on these earlier practices of information management. Only in digital form, they are abstracted, removed from the epistemological and social coordinates it stemmed from. So the life of biological information took off in the late 18th century with the invention of taxonomy by the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus. Natural history since these early modern times became most explicitly devoted to data management. And the desire to create an inventory of all life on Earth became a logical and systematic mission by ordering complex taxonomies that allowed to quantify species information. The early emergence of this desire to classify and represent life on Earth on a global scale was inseparable from colonial, racialized, and gendered ways of seeing and forms of exploitation. So Linnaeus included humans amongst the taxonomies of animal species and divided them into categories based on physical appearance and behavior. These classifications were later enhanced by others through hierarchizing racial types, commonly with white Europeans at the top and Africans at the bottom. These early classifications were setting the stage for the development of racist scientific disciplines such as eugenics and physical anthropology. And museums, as the databases of natural history, were instrumental in legitimizing these racist ideas in collections, in labels, and more broadly in scientific thought. So while racist disciplines were officially disregarded as non-scientific after World War II, recent examples of racism and sexism and other forms of oppression in the digital technologies, we can think of AI, for example, which including the aggregation of big data and the algorithmic analysis. All this reminds us that the structures of data are inseparable from the ideologies and worldviews and assumptions held by the humans who create them. So when we talk about current new technologies as a digital revolution or transformation, we risk undermining continuities, reifying all those material, epistemological, and political structures and practices that do not change, that persist, and are embedded in technological mechanisms. This perception of the new and revolutionary is evident when we see that many times after digitization in archives and other institutions, physical collections are sent to deep storage with little access to researchers and let alone for publics. Or in worse cases, they might be discarded altogether, eliminating the possibility to find the source and deconstruct historical narratives through critique and interpretation. So millions of specimens in Western institutions materially encode the subjugation of local and indigenous peoples, their knowledges, nomenclatures, their naming systems, and practices. They are often trophies of exploitative labor relations, slavery, and genocide. Natural history specimens are material evidence of the inseparability between Western science and colonialism. And no doubt that keeping them stored, black boxing them in Western institutions, reenacts and perpetuates colonial possessions and current forms of domination, inequality, racism, and distrust. And so, if digitization unlocks all these objects and makes them public, will it mean the end of storage? Will it enable to dismantle colonial possessions and formations which are already embedded in museums' collections? Time will tell, but one thing is for sure, that these deep and haunting societal and political and epistemological problems that museums are complicit in won't be solved by technology alone. Because by assembling seemingly neutral technical apparatuses for findability and accessibility, we are also creating a new black box, a new kind of dominant epistemic machine that is based on certain assumptions and ideologies of a community of experts. If we seek to transition toward decolonial and just futures, we need to open these black boxes to unpack the tacit assumptions and ideologies they embed. In that regard, the FAIR principles have turned into a dominant standard and a universal convention in the advancement of open science, as I said, and data sharing. But when we think about it, data sharing is a universal good only if we ignore the colonial and scientific expropriation of indigenous intellectual property and cultural heritage. In recent years, we are witnessing the emergence of initiatives that advance indigenous data sovereignty. The Global Indigenous Data Alliance shows that indigenous people have always been data collectors and knowledge holders. The CARE principles, which is an acronym of collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, are data standards that are developed by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, which reflect a growing global concern about the need to protect against the misuse of indigenous data and to ensure indigenous people are the primary beneficiaries of their data. These principles do not contradict the FAIR principles, but they actually complement them. They're encouraging the open data movement and other data movements to consider both people and purpose in their advocacy and pursuits. And these CARE principles were also embraced by ICOM, the global network of museums, and also by the Global Collections Group, which is a group made of the big collecting institutions around the world. It's an alliance of around 74 or 3 collecting institutions. But still, although it has been embraced, it will be difficult to synchronize the digital economy's logic of speed and efficiency together with advancing recognition and responsibility and developing relations of trust and addressing persistent formations of colonial injustice. All this would require, we can say, what Isabel Stengers calls slow science, which means thinking with the abstraction of science and technology rather than taking them for granted or obeying them. And I want to finish by showing you 2 examples to open the stage for Ofri and her examples in the fields of art and activism. One is this project that really kind of follows Stanger's work in terms of working with technology without obeying its abstractions. And this is If Objects Could Speak, which is by the International Inventories Program. It focuses on repatriation and uses digital 3D modeling in order to investigate the origins of an old object stored in a German museum. They traveled to Kenya with this digital twin to find out if there is any knowledge about this artifact today, and mostly to understand what this artifact means to the people as it is being present digitally and absent in a physical way. And another last interesting project in that regard is the decentralized labeling project called Local Context, which offers indigenous communities a tool to add cultural and historical context and indigenous authority by labeling cultural heritage content in digital archives, in libraries, in museums, and other digital repositories globally. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Ofri, and I would like to start with thanking thank Einat and Danny and Nofit and everyone who made this event possible. And I'll jump right in. I feel like those 2 presentations were very much in dialogue, so many times I kind of will go back and forth between your thoughts and words, Hagit. And I'll start with a story because this event starts with an error. So in one very long night in September 2018, a fire basically burned to ashes the entire National Museum in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, that if anyone knows was a major museum with 20 million objects. Just to orient you, the British Museum has 8 million in its collection. So it's massive museum, but it was also a research institution and part of the university and a major archive. So kind of to orient us what was in it. So this indigenous headpiece and this chikuna mask was a major part of it, but also Luzia, the oldest human remain ever found in Brazil, was there, but also a major collection of dinosaurs, and, because it was both anthropological museum, but also a national, kind of a combo kind of mega encyclopedic museum, and a major collection of anthropoids and butterflies from the Amazonas, and this. Chilean mummy that was found seated and then was seated there for a couple of 100 years, and this Lazy Susan as well. But also a major linguistic collection of a lot of recording of different kinds of indigenous languages that are no longer practiced or now basically gone forever. This guy's meteorite Bendigo survived, no problem. So now seen covered by all these kind of neighboring objects. And I like to think about this moment not only of physical objects, but all the multiple knowledges and protocols and pedagogical standards and words and research that being collected and in many ways matter and otherwise are being covered by this only major survivor that always stood right after the turnstiles because they pushed it and pushed it and pushed it and they couldn't push it more and it just stayed there. So one thing, and I like to start always with this kind of a framing as error because it was a multiple error that came into place in one night. One was a short circuit in the electricity, actually in the air condition that started the fire in one wing, but it really progressed over the course of 6 hours. Imagine communities of the entire city, of the students who are there and the researchers and all the employees standing there, hundreds of people standing there and really seeing the museum fall wing after wing. And the reason for that was because, not only what's in the museum, but also, like we know here and other places, also natural resources were privatized. And when the fire department came to start and taking care of the fire, they realized that there is no running water in the fire hydrants. And it took hours actually to find way and to kind of stretch hose from the man-made lake below this mansion that once was a palace and then the National Museum of Humankind or Mankind. And that was how this catastrophe was really almost nothing survived, and it was described as a lobotomy in Brazilian memory. And I would like to think for a moment with this possibility of error and really suggest that this 2018 fire is no longer or can no longer be understood as incidental, and but as a result of very systematic neglect. So positioning this error as a simple mistake or honest mistake assume its ability to be a marker of a fault. But this error really must be politicized, because this catastrophe wasn't caused by an unfortunate administrative error in the system, but as a result of a major crisis that is a result of austerity that framed as an error, and a possibility to, affect also by climate crisis. And I have been actually following this kind of event ever since. And I can say that most of the, more and more museums are going to suffer, or museum, archive, and so on, are going to suffer either fires or floods. So this is an ongoing concern, and here comes the story of the digitized. But I would this event. I mean, for many indigenous activists and researchers, this event was described as a second genocide. So no longer objects and other artifacts of knowledge being collected took away and being collected in one space. But this space along the year, the archive and the museum, became a space of study, of research, of recontextualize, of telling many stories, and meeting other community members. And the fact, and that's kind of going back to the error that is being systematically neglected and ended the way it ended, came as no surprise. And I would like to think for a moment on this idea of afterness, institutional afterness, or more specific here, the museum afterness that apply to this incompleteness, to the incomplete moment or state between the no longer and the not yet. So this is temporally category, of course, but I would like also to, in connection to what you said, Hagit, also to think about it spatially as the moment that, temporally an event or an institution ended, but in many ways we are still in debt to the conditions being, allowing it and allowing its end. And we are living within, the object was removed, but the conditions are very much active. And I would say also in terms of, matter, body, and digital. So, the weeks after the museum burned, the museum, if you want, kind of landed quietly on the city, on doorsteps and streets, because it's just as dust, as fragments, and many different ways, and people kind of carried it and so on and so forth. But also as not only as a temporal category, but also as a spatial category of kind of the end of the museum order as an ideal way of organizing knowledge, and what happened when this system, physical system of front edge and back, and black box or back end of the index and the shelves are collapsing and kind of inviting a different speciality into the system, and as an epistemic category that we are left in the remains, both in matter, in body, and as I suggest, in data, and can think through them in terms of transitions. So I would like to take a few moments, or a few kind of mini cases that have been left over after this event. And they all, specifically today, I'll be focusing on digital afterness. So they all kind of related to the digital realm. So I got into this case not from the Brazilian story. I'm not from Brazil. I showed there a lot, lived there, but it's not really kind of my entry point, but much more through museum studies and critical technology. One would hope that in 2018, the surviving ratio in the digital realm, as we spoke about it, sometimes have too muchness when it comes to the digital. We are living in the age of kind of algorithmic reproduction and hyper documentation. One would hope that in the digital realm, the survival rate will be kind of slightly better than the Library of Alexandria, but almost nothing survived in the digital realm. So a handful, really handful of 3D models. And a virtual tour, the one made by Google, and we all, for a second, got obsessed with them in the early days of COVID. And then, but this has nothing to do with Brazil. It has nothing to do with the museum. It's the same technology, capture your streets, made by the 9 famous eyes of Google. It stayed, you mentioned cloud services before. It stays on the Google clouds. The benefit goes to California. It is in many ways, and that's kind of what I often look at in case of digital colonialism. It's really extending off same kind of standards of power, but shifting from the state, the museum state, as the main colonializer into a corporate kind of colonial relation with our data and our digital holding. So that's by itself, but you can visit the museum, the no longer existing museum right here in the virtual tour. But the other thing that survived and will be more, I think, relevant for today is at the night, remember that everyone stay there and look at that, using Wikimedia Foundation platform, local students started a campaign to ask people to contribute everything, every picture they ever took, everything, whatever they have, and this campaign went from national to international the day after. Now, listen, one link. People uploaded everything that usually in Wikimedia will be off. Like if I upload the picture of my sweet kid into the metropolitan entry in Wikimedia, the community will take it off in a second. But here people upload blurred pictures, double pictures, pictures of the kids, selfies. I mean, think about what you take when you go to museum. Everything. Now, a moment which I think is interesting here. When I go and I take my picture at the Tate, and it was so cool, the exhibition, I share it with my WhatsApp group, and I put it on Instagram, and I put it on social media, and actually and sometimes it's on my phone, and then my phone died, it's been sent to other places. Actually, every single image here, and very different from the kind of the logic of the rarity that organized museum, every image here is a collection. Every image here lives in many different devices, through many different technologies, and also through many different lives and narration already. And I love those pictures that are kind of, to use Hito style, poor images in their kind of non-professional, but look at this mommy who kind of break the fourth wall. But we know so much, we know it was summer. We know it was female that took these pictures. I mean, that's extremely rich in terms of connectedness and situatedness. We know a lot about museum apparatus and the lighting and the other fixtures. Or this one, when the classic butterflies are pinned to the board, but through the window and through the reflection, the kind of the lush greenery of the Amazonas, the habitus, is kind of traveling in. Every file name is different. Some of them are following the Linnaeus, the who discovered them, like the species scientific names. But look at that. We have like 12 images of Sophia and Dino 11, Sophia and Dino 12. So this primary school age Sophia and her purple stuffed monkey is kind of, if we think of the history of representation in colonial museum, it's kind of the new princess of, it's like the new Las Meninas of this collection, which is completely disorienting. Many technology of order, technology of meaning, technology, and technology of space of the classical museum. And I like to think about it, as I mentioned before, I called it from a collection to a form of collective recollection. Thank you. Well, maybe in the Q&A or later, quite a lot been done with it. Unfortunately, also been ordered. But just one thing that is very interesting, you remind me with the black box. In parallel, Wikidata activists actually, so I say that the collection was not digitized, but they had a database with the information about many objects. And data activists from Wikimedia actually broke into the computer and copied a lot of the things, and then less than 24 hours later, the computer was shut down. So many black boxes were blocked because, as you said, that's where, in many ways, things are being shaped and organized. And one of the things the data activists did is, based on those pictures that have been uploaded, recreated and connected them to the data and recreated the room that was dedicated to Black Brazilian heritage. So that's something that's been made very quickly. There was a major piece in the New York Times that spoke about the curatorial opportunities, and I just want to remind it here, or kind of to mention it here, as in a dialogue with other moments of returning objects. Here we have some sort of a ground zero moment, which allowed different activists, researchers, to be in a dialogue and think, how can we curate it back, the collection, in a way that is more transition, more just, telling truth, telling multiple stories, and following different logic. And I just want to say that there is also here, and I heard it a couple of times, indigenous leaders are not interested in receiving back the object, which is always a debate around this. But what they're interested is, as they say, I love this line, to soften the white man's heart. So we want the objects to be, but we want to be a different voice in the around the table. But what they want, there is a debate. They say like, hey, big kids on the block in the European Museum already digitized everything. They took, but they also digitized. They have all the digital, documentation, and we want to be in a we want to return it, and we want to think about multiple platforms. We want to involve care and multiple stories, and also multiple institutions that tell different information about these stories. And maybe going back to thinking with, as also thinking with artistic practices, will be my end note. So in a big project I've done, I kind of thought about those museum remains and active protocols of relations. And in this video installation that now travel, called Leaking Lens, I asked, what if all those digital remains, 3D virtual tours, and this collection can become sites to host meeting, to host multiple stories, to host different conversation, and to host different kind of thinking with museums remain. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and I apologize again for the inconvenience. End of semester, I just couldn't leave my class. So I'm going to talk about a different kind of digitization and a different kind of decolonization. I'm going to take you out into the urban space, and I'm going to talk about a project that we recently completed in Bezalel Academy of Arts and Design in collaboration with Jerusalem Development Corporation, which works in collaboration with the Jerusalem Municipality and the National Library of Israel. And I'm going to introduce to you a project of the digitization of archival collections, several collections, that deal with the history, the modern history of Jerusalem. The project is called The project is called the Jerusalem Architectural Archives and the digitization of. It is a platform for studying architecture and design in modern Jerusalem, the outcome of a practical project which I just introduced. The project, it was recently completed. We're still managing the actual exposition. Apparently the most difficult, the most challenging stage in the digitization is the actual the projection of the digitized object. The purpose of the database is to make unique and important material which documents the recent past of Jerusalem, including urban plans, building plans, urban maps, photographs, and related documentation, accessible to planners, to architects, to conservation practitioners, in order to enhance sustainable development and conservation, as well as for researchers from a wide variety of fields in the public. The creation of the database for professional purposes is based on the need expressed in the Israeli planning and building law to base policies of conservation and inscription of buildings as worthy of conservation on information and documentation. So what we're dealing with here is the actual documentation. It also adheres to recent UN Sustainable Development Goals, and I quote, to strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage as part of a specific goal to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So there is an inherent gap here between the Israeli documentation and preservation law and the UN goals, which talk about something much more inclusive, much more resilient, and much more democratic. The project is based on the understanding that the digitization of such documents will improve the scientific basis of conservation files or larger scale management plans and will support decision makers. So one end of the project is practical. Let's do better conservation. Let's base conservation on proper documentation. However, another purpose of the project is the democratization of Jerusalem heritage, making historic documents widely available without the agency of the archives and their inevitable shortcomings in exposing local history. And we've just heard fantastic expositions about the shortcomings of museums which portray those documents and artifacts. In fact, recent research in the history of geography of Jerusalem already challenges the traditional readings of the modern city and its development, relying on new approaches to reading history in general and that of post-colonial cities, such as Jerusalem in particular. So, unlike the traditional dichotomic narrative, new research reflects the new relational history approach, striving to present a more integrative analysis of the history of Jews and Arabs in modern Palestine and the spaces they produced. Similarly, and I'll show you this. Similarly, while common research generally traces the modern development of the city to the British rule, which started in 1918, new approaches call to start the story at the late Ottoman era, the end of the 19th century. Some readings challenge the common historical narratives, which rely on formal institution documentation of the city, and call to expose documents which tell stories from below, relating to daily life and conduct in the city, rather than from above. Broader challenges to local archival research already arise from the epistemic archival turn, which allows our talk today, which views archives as an epistemological experiment rather than simply repositories of facts. However, urban heritage is distinctly different from urban history. The geographer Dennis Cosgrove described urban heritage as a creation which is curated and conserved, possessed, and performed. This distinction between urban history and the curation or performance of urban heritage is especially significant in complex cities, which landscapes have been shaped by opposing communities. Indeed, research relating to the urban heritage of colonial cities point to an inherent gap existing between the preservation of colonial city, of the built heritage of the majority of the population or culture, and the neglect or even destruction, and we speak about built landscapes, so destruction is irreversible, of that of the minority's culture, which sometimes was or still is contested or oppressed. The urban history of Israeli-Palestinian city today can be similarly categorized as unbalanced and incomplete, leading to an imbalanced reading of present-day urban scape and its preservation. The existing reading or literature tend to identify and glorify certain urban fabrics, while overlooking, sometimes easily erasing others. This lacuna eventually leads to the underrepresentation of conservation sites, which document only certain historic layers of the Israeli-Palestinian city, thus reinforcing a narrow, national, Israeli, inevitable colonial historical narrative. And I'd like to show you some examples. In Jerusalem, this is a snapshot of the website of the Israeli Council for the Conservation of Heritage Sites in Israel, and it's just a snapshot of Jerusalem. And as you can see, the related sites to Jerusalem all include either biblical sites or those which connect to early Zionist endeavors or Jewish literary cultural figures, and this is basically the majority of the list. Lately, researchers employing the settler colonial paradigm, which provokes a renewed outlook on the implications of settler power relations in space, call for a new outlook on their history and eventually definition of heritage. Researchers agree that while the built heritage of colonial cities tend to duplicate colonial categories and serve narrow sectional interests, it nevertheless, the city, forms the best place for uncovering indigenous identity and its intertwined relationships with urban space. The Israeli geographer Oren Yiftachel and Australian planner Libby Porter, who call for the decolonization of the colonial city, also include its urban heritage, insist on the right to the city of a variety of its inhabitants, turning to uncover different urban histories or heritages, thus extracting a complementary, sometimes altogether alternative, urban heritage, a process which other researchers term liberation history. In fact, both in Australia and Canada and also in New Zealand, great efforts are already being made into this process. Some components include, and these are just illustrations of the internet. Don't ask me about their particular meaning, but I think they portray an array of sites which are different. Things that are not always legible for us Westerners looking at them. We don't always understand their meaning for the people for whom this is heritage. So how do they do it? They widen the definition of heritage in general and national heritage in particular. They define indigenous heritage by listing sites which hold meanings for indigenous traditions or indigenous nations, for which purpose a whole new toolkit had to be devised, because obviously those who are responsible for defining local heritage do not understand, cannot conceive the meanings embedded in these sites. These efforts also include an overall discourse of the communities defining themselves local identity while using their own terminology. And also abandoning the use of temporal frameworks, as these are most often meaningless to indigenous inhabitants. And I already hinted at this in Jerusalem. The change of the geopolitical structure from the Ottoman to the British made a shift in the way we define our heritage. But it's the same buildings and it's the same people who build them, so why make the change? Because we are accustomed to and we categorize. And finally, demanding to consult directly with the locals in anything that relates to their own cultural heritage and its inclusion in the work of locals or conservation committees. So we're back to practice. How do we bring this back to the planning committee table, which has to decide whether the building should be termed eligible or worthy of conservation or not? In response to these notions, the Jerusalem Architectural Archives Project strove to create a democratic exposition of archival material concerning the planning and building of modern Jerusalem. We widened the scope of archives usually examined for this purpose, incorporating documentation of the development of Jerusalem under various regimes, from the Ottoman through the British, the Jordanian, and finally, the Israeli. Similarly, we concentrated on the city and its built environment, rather than surrender to historical and political conventions, i.e. categorization. We continuously question the terminology and categories which are used for tagging documents and cataloging them, creating a common Jerusalem ontology, or so we wish to believe. As we wish to expose the material to as many readers as possible, thus allowing various communities and individuals to make their own stories of the city, we strove to catalog the documents in 3 languages, obviously Hebrew, Arabic, and English. This endeavor brought up many issues of transliteration and nomenclature, exposing different, sometimes even competing interpretations which had to be negotiated. Translation is not only a literal thing, it has so many layers of interpretation and cultural meanings. Finally, we exposed their findings to the public and recorded their impression, leading us to conclusions regarding both the documents themselves and the meaning the documents themselves held for various communities. And I will now describe only 3 of the 8 collections which were incorporated in the project, and I will illustrate briefly the changing narrative which was made available through their exposition. So these are some of the images from the Ottoman Archives of the Prime Minister's Office, or we call it in short, the Ottoman Archives collection stored in Istanbul. So we went back to the origins of modern Jerusalem. To expand our understanding of the making of modern Jerusalem, we coordinated our research with a team of researchers at Kadir Has University, Istanbul. And the team was outsourced to identify and locate a selection of visual images and documents on the urban development of Jerusalem, which are stored in the Ottoman archives. Focusing on the years between the Tanzimat Edict and the end of the Ottoman sovereignty, 1839 to 1917, the team reported finding a vast number of documents relating to spatial changes that occurred in Ottoman Jerusalem. To limit the scope, they focused on religious and public buildings, searching for the attitude of the Ottoman administration to building activity, and prioritizing archival documents that include architectural drawings, which is what we were actually looking for. Just a note, after we did this outsourcing and they reported to us back about their process of collection, we realized that unintentionally we actually made another level of interpretation and selection. And that's a note for the next stage of the project. They eventually retrieved about 200 documents, which are already digitized by the archives, and they divided them into 3 units: repairs, replacement, and actual new construction. As the researchers explained in the report they attached to their findings, the documents provide an opportunity to examine how Ottoman modernization, this is their own words, expressed itself in Al-Quds al-Sharif, the Ottoman name of Jerusalem, which came to life as part of the delicate balance between the state intervention and local demands, as reflected in the correspondence which was retrieved. The research allowed to unveil the inherent urban agenda behind these independent interventions and to question whether they can be considered parts of an organized urban agenda of local modernization, which was completely unknown to us, Israeli mandate-oriented researchers. We received images of the documents written in Ottoman Turkish with their translation into English made back in Istanbul, and we translated them into Hebrew, and finally, in order to expose them, into local Arabic. This multilingual translation process raised many queries, as you can already imagine. Another collection is the official British planning of Jerusalem between 1948 and 1918 and 1948, which is the basic planning of the Jerusalem, basic modern institutional statutory planning of Jerusalem, and it still makes the basis for Jerusalem planning until today. It is kept in the Jerusalem municipality, and it naturally became a major component in our project, although this was the most difficult archive to work with. They have so many constraints and so many restrictions on the exposition of the files, on the actual entrance to the archive. It's only open 9 hours a week, and you have to make a reservation, and you're not allowed to make copies or to take out any documents. And for me as a practitioner, this is a great challenge because we need these documents to plan, to work. The collection was researched also by a local planner who worked in the municipality for many, many years and gained his own intimate acquaintance with it. Otherwise, we would not have been able to make ends of this amazing collection. The most important of the plans, which he set aside in a unit he called Town Planning Schemes, it's a series which holds the most detailed and complex information encompassing all other series, and basically the most important of them is the 27 first plans for Jerusalem ever made from 1918 till about the 1930s. They include 16 districts or neighborhood plans that contain most of the built-up area of the city, plans for the future ring roads in the city, and if you are a local Jerusalemite, you can understand the importance of plans made in the 1920s and only carried out in the 1990s. It's still the same plans, and they're held in the municipality behind many locked walls. And finally, a different collection, a personal collection, a private collection, Ben-Zion Gini was born in Izmir in 1869. He moved to Ottoman Palestine 20 years later. He studied mechanical engineering in Paris, and eventually he was appointed by the Ottomans as the city engineer of Jaffa. In 1917, just before the Ottomans were drawn away, he became the first city engineer of Jerusalem. He continued in this position under the Mandate regime as the first British municipal engineer in Jerusalem, and he worked in this capacity until 1926, making him a very important and very interesting link between Ottomans and British. In fact, the same plans that were done by the British were already started by Gini just a few years earlier. And he also designed a few Jewish and Muslim buildings in the city, and he did a lot of work in parceling and planning. And his most important, the most important plan he made is basically the background for the first British plan, which shows us the continuation of the actual planning process. Nothing really started with the British. His collection is private, it's held with his family, and it was for us it was crucial to expose it, to make the link which doesn't exist between the two regimes. We wanted to expose these documentations to the public, and we held an exhibition in Jerusalem back in January last year. It was during the time of the Omicron, so obviously we didn't come and see it. But it was a beautiful exposition, first an initial exposition of some of the documentation. The top line of pictures is back in Istanbul, and the bottom is back in Hansen House. This exposition was a wonderful chance for us, the planners and the curators, to examine the public's response to the pictures. And it was overwhelming. People recognized and identified buildings they know. They recognized mistakes in the actual inscription. So of course we went back to check our own notes. Most of the mistakes were original. Most of the mistakes were made by the Ottomans, which was for us fascinating because it made us question our whole cataloging system. Whose mistakes are we copying? Are we still repeating the same mistakes? But what I want to show you for the end is the very beginning of our analysis of the discrepancies between the various collections. I'm sorry for the Hebrew, I'll translate. The pictures to the left, this is a plan of the opening, the development of Jaffa Gate, and its widening by the Turks in 1898 in order to allow the German Kaiser to enter the city on a horse and carriage. And these are pictures of another gate that the Ottomans opened in the walls, the New Gate. It was opened a few years earlier in the 1880s. And they manifest a direct, immediate modernization of the people, of the population of Jerusalem. So a demand made by them to open the walls of the city. We copied these, we traced this back to letters in Ottomans, which were translated, as I said, into four different languages. And we actually learned of the local need to open the gates in order to allow connection, immediate connection between the old city and the new city. For me as a planner, this is urban revitalization, urban regeneration, urban modernization. The pictures on the right are maps, two maps made by Charles Robert Ashby, one of the British planners of Jerusalem, which 20 years later, actually wished to do the exact opposite. The British idea of modernizing Jerusalem was to divide it and to restrict access from the old city to the new city, to actually separate them, as you can see by the park, which they planned to surround the old city. They were devastated by these images and by their results. And they said, how can you have no regard for your heritage? These are the walls of the ancient holy city of Jerusalem. How can you reach and open openings to them? What we have to do is close back the wall, shut down the gates, surround the old city with a park. This is proper modernization. The irony is that when we think of the heritage of Jerusalem, these are the images we adopted. When we think of the heritage of Holy Jerusalem, Ottoman Jerusalem, we go back to the British images. I actually have a quote of a planner in 1968, after the city was reunited, said, "We were amazed, we were surprised to realize that we have the same notions as the British had 50 years earlier. This is how Jerusalem should be conserved. This is our heritage. This is what we have to do as planners and conservationists." But when we look for someone else's heritage, someone else's modernization of the city, all we have to do is go back 20 years later, go back to the archives and expose a completely different story. Thank you very much.
Ended my presentation with a question about this relationship of memory, digital memory to transitional justice, and I thought it was very interesting. I still haven't fully digested Jerusalem, so it's just in terms of the immediate two presentations that followed, I thought it was very interesting because both of them raised questions about the fact that there's no stable understanding of justice given this, so that you can't, posing the question as whether digital memory is going to promote transitional justice or human rights is kind of the wrong question. What we see is that given the changes, epistemic changes, there's an ongoing and different understanding. So I thought in your presentation, you raised the issue of the presentism of the digital and the loss of history. And so I thought of how there was, the question of injustice, of historical justice is very, it seemed to be present, in yours. And I thought with Ofri's, it was very interesting that after the loss in the museum, you raised the point that the indigenous peoples, they weren't obsessing about restitution, which might have been, here we were looking at objet and so on, but rather education, humanistic education, the lack of humanity that they wanted, you had a quote there about the fact that they wanted to tame the heart of the white man. And that is, so again, it was this very interesting, it reminded me of Judith Shklar with the Lisbon earthquake, where she wrote a book about, from tragedy to injustice, where the people at the time saw it as a matter of tragedy and were praying, but those who were the modern philosophers saw that this had the fire, which fell more, the fire affected more of the poor people, just like what we had in Katrina, and what we have generally affects those, that there was a different understanding of injustice as a result of this error or fire. So there were really interesting strands, and it made me reconceive the question of the relationship of digital memory to transitional justice. So, and I think your ending with opening the gates is really a lovely visual to end the panel with. So I really enjoyed it. I really thought that was wonderful. Yeah. So. Yeah. Really.
Any thoughts from the panel, or should we?
Maybe open it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's a wonderful panel, and sorry, thank you. But it sounds that there is a sense of justice, especially from the two presentations, and it's about giving voice and ownership, because every archive, including human rights archives, are mediated, selected. The information. There's no raw information without the story. So it sounds like there is a sense of justice. And I wonder how it fits with legal notions of justice, because giving voice doesn't, and you see it even in the South African Truth Commission, giving voice and accounts are not necessarily becoming evidence, legal truth. There are different kinds of truth here. If we think about justice as coming from colonizing the museum and the archive.
I think it was more on the legal side than, I don't know.
Well,
From my understanding, it was a.
All I would say is that in terms of the digital, yes, it's true that for example, the Truth Report, the South African Truth Report, or the Latin American reports, they were highly structured and highly controlled reports. The way I conceive of the digital database is a freer and more open. So if the concern is who's controlling it, I do see from the examples of Argentina, Chile, again, limited because we were looking at our piece. And now when I think of AI and the fact that the piece is not out yet, and there are these huge developments that, maybe that will be big TRCs on the AI could be
okay, good.
Let's start something, so we can control it. But I do think that there will be that one of the the highlight of, I think, the digital is connectivity, right? The connective part of it, and possible more solidarity communities and victims groups being able to reach out, and we've already seen that in a number of instances.
Syria is one. I think Ukraine, Russia is also probably the second most documented. So I would say that I see this as possibly freer and more emancipatory, but I think there's also a cautionary note, which was raised by, I think the first by Hagi, which was the turn from the state control to the corporate, which is we're putting this stuff in the cloud. So I don't know if I'm comfortable with the shift from a number of elite commissioners to some guy in California, some rich guy in California. I mean, so if I have to choose, I think I might go back to the elite commissioner. I don't know, but maybe we won't have to choose, But I think it's a worthworthwhile question, about the curation and
I
control.
think maybe we shouldn't choose. And I think maybe just to say something, I'm not sure, don't think it answers your question, but say something about truth. I think in this panel we had different kinds of truths. We had the political truth, which is more like a collective way of thinking of how to produce truth. And we also had a professional scientific truth, which is operating in different levels, but in a way very inseparable. For me, working on these subjects of the museum collections, it's always entangled. It's very, very hard to differentiate between these two. Maybe we can hear more.
Please.
Thank you very much for the presentations. I just wanted to build on the point you just made, which I think is very interesting, and on the, let's say, more open approach to things through digitization. And I'll give you a concrete example. I'm very much interested to hear your views, because in the case of Colombia, we had, first thing we did, actually I was involved in this myself, we actually digitized a good many, not exactly everything, but a good many of the documents and everything we did during the negotiations. Actually follow that, judge for themselves. And then, fast forward, we just had for those who don't know, we had a big truth commission that finished its report last year. And I was very much in touch with them, and the president, I actually had negotiated a mandate. And they really had huge difficulty coming to the final report, because we have 11 people. And there's something utopian and frankly absurd about the idea that you're going to have kind of one narrative about what happened in a complex conflict. So I said to them, well, look, to the president, why didn't you actually put more emphasis on the archive? Why didn't you make sure that the National Archive has this, set up a good system of access to the archive, and then say, look, this is our take on this, but anybody who wants to can actually then go and access the archive and judge for themselves what they make of everything that we heard from the victims and the perpetrators and so forth, to the extent that it's possible. Not everything is public, to the extent it's public. So I think there's actually huge potential for this. And I think it's not just more democratic, but actually more realistic. If you say, we did this huge amount of work, through 3 years we convened victims to come forward and to give their, we got perpetrators, we got institutions to say whatever, and here's all. And you can write your own view of what this is. We don't pretend to have the last word.
No, I think that's really, really interesting, and I mentioned we cite to it in the paper because I think that Colombia, as a current example, is of a transitional justice process, has actually undertaken this archival approach to the truth report, and as you say, now it seems so weird the way those official reports were written, right? The idea that one report. One short book, right, based on 9 months or 6 months, was going to give people the story of it. I mean, it almost seems like from another century. So I think we see that there's the epistemic has changed, right? As Foucault said, every political regime has a different truth regime. I think that we are seeing that the digital and this archival approach, is a move to, some theorists call it memory of the multitude. Maybe it's not the multitude, but it's definitely something other than this fixed report that's from an elite that tries to just tell the full story in a way that clearly was never the full story. So there's something in a way more modest, right, about it, more modest and yet more ambitious, right, in your archive. So I think it's great, and my understanding is it also connects to ongoing human rights, monitoring the archive. So I hope that will be followed, by other countries undergoing. I think it's a great model.
Is there? Should I speak to?
Maybe just before you
Yeah.
ask your question, I just want to say that I think that we really have to be careful to differentiate between the digital and the archival, especially because even though the archives are always held by the hegemony, still it is public assets, while the digital archives are totally privatized, and it's hard to compute this difference because the discourse of the digital is as if it is for everyone, everywhere, anytime.
And I would maybe add that the fact that it's intangible and invisible, even if the file is visible, the system of holding and organizing is invisible, is making it even harder subject of critique.
I mean, it could be public, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's
Exactly.
distinctive concepts, but it could be public. The
And
digital
digital.
could be
Totally.
public, right? I mean, it's so
We're still
figuring it out. But
We're still in very early ages.
Yeah.
We're just figuring out how
Yes.
much of a privatization it is.
The digital asset can be public, but there's always, I mean, National Archive is not a tech company.
Sure.
And Metropolitan Museum does not have server farms. So there's always, I mean, like, who do you say, who do you give the contract to? I mean, it's never fully, until it meets the public eye, it's actually going through many different categories, business choices that actually shape how this.
But it could be
this object
regulated
is.
through legislation, right? It could. It could.
And then the question then would be how.
A close,
But it
a
needs to
close
be-
study,
yeah, we need
a
to-
close
yeah.
study of Google Art and Culture specifically can say that it's kind of mimicking, replicate, it's like 3 bids kind of to Manhattan kind of exchanges. It's quite unbelievable. And in terms of, wow, we have all the collections available for everyone, and it doesn't include any monetary exchange for the end user. It's, I think, quite
Interesting.
different
But
complications.
there might be
Maybe.
historical analogies, and I think about this a lot when we think about lawn technology, because the advent of the printing press combined with increased literacy, for example, photography, audio recordings, things that are still relatively, maybe 150 years old, but they had a significant, I think, impact on the way we perceive narratives of justice, inter alia, mass media. And all of these had mediums in the sense of business involvement, like the television networks, and at least in one hemisphere. In other parts of the world, and they were controlled by the government. Which one is better? So,
I think that. Well, I wanted to let you ask. Go ahead.
I just actually it's a continuation of everything that's been said, so actually it's quite all right. I have to say I love this panel. It's so rich in substance, and your discussion right now was actually a connection that I wanted to make between the law of your question. At first sight, this panel is so rich, and at first hand, the legal question could sound reductionist, like reducing the substance and the riches. But I think if we're talking about the legal, the question really is about ownership and responsibility, and what you said, Hagit, about the public and the private. The archive is public, and when I was looking at Brazil, devastating, the question of ownership, the fact that it doesn't belong to Brazil or to a specific community, it's knowledge, it also goes beyond the object, and it's knowledge that should belong to humanity. That's why we're talking about cultural heritage. And perhaps the correct it's the suggestion here, of institution, it has to be a multilateral institution, something international. It's not that I'm over romanticizing about the virtues of international institutions, they have their faults, but the the advantage is that it wouldn't belong just to one sort of stakeholder, including the private stakeholders. So if I talk about business and human rights and private and public, this is sort of the connection. It should be some kind of international umbrella of cultural heritage, the law, but without reducing the substance, and then what can the digital world sort of the advantages and then the risks and all that.
Anyone else? Yeah.
So it's sort of a thought. I don't know if you have anything to add to that or comment, but I was just thinking, especially about Ofri and now your presentation and kind of what can be done with the archive. So there's the legal matter, but if we go back to participation and maybe how the archive can work with the scenario, with people, bring communities together. The internet has all these potentials of connectivity and bringing people together, but after COVID, it's really safe to say that it also lacks a lot of forms of participation, conversation, and engagement. And I'm not sure if that's also something that needs to be addressed. I don't know, forms of not only regulating it, but also thinking of how to take it further through community action, artistic projects, and so on.
Yes, so I was just writing myself down here, the different layers of the implications on what we're doing. So first of all, there is the implication. I think the most interesting dimension in our three talks, other than digitization and going back to the archives, is the actual exposition and the democratization of that knowledge, with all the implications that we know there already are. So I think it's the exposure is more than doubled here. There's actually an additional dimension to the actual exposition. It's not only exposing all those documents via digitization or any other digital or technological means. It's getting the response from the public. In Ofri's presentation, it's inevitable seeing the reflections and the kids being reflected or viewing the actual objects through the kids' image. So I think it's this exposition has an extra layer teaching us about the way the objects are received. And this has implication obviously on the actual practice. That's maybe for me. What do we do with this extra layer of information that we receive from the public, and can we embed it? Can we use it back in practice, which was basically our original intention? Of course, it went way beyond what we could imagine. But how do we eventually pick up all the information that we are now producing and bringing it back into practice? And also, of course, how does it affect science? How is this information eventually used or incorporated in greater conceptualization? And I think you're right. I think we're still working on the conceptualization. I think we're running behind. It's the technology and so much is going on, and we're lacking behind with our own conclusions. And eventually, there's also, of course, the most interesting and the most sentimental implication, the sentimental dimension, which was brought up here a few times. How do we feel? How do we feel? How is our heart changed by the exposition, by this the direct exposition of the actual information, and we get the notion as viewers as if we can participate in the next layer of production of knowledge, which obviously we do, but how are we affected in the process? So I think these are very interesting dimensions to examine.
So please join me in thanking this very rich panel and.